So you have Colonel Byrd. Byrd's invasion of Kentucky. During the American Revolutionary War was one phase of an extensive planned series of operations planned by the British in 1780, whereby the entire West from Quebec to the Gulf of Mexico was to be kept swept clear of both Spanish and colonial resistance. While Byrd's campaign met with limited success, raiding 2 fortified settlements, it failed in its primary objective. Other British operations also failed. The British Indian victory. Captain Henry Byrd, Captain Alexander McKee, Simon Girty, and Blue Jacket were all part of Byrd's invasion of Kentucky. There's a motley crew. So you had Captain Henry Byrd, the British. The British were all in Detroit. They were stationed at Detroit. Captain Alexander McKee. Alexander McKee was Girty's friend. He was an agent in the British Indian Department during the French and Indian War, American Revolutionary War, and the Northwest Indian War. His father was Thomas was an Irish immigrant. So the Byrd's invasion of Kentucky. So British authorities during the spring of 1780 prepared to carry out a comprehensive plan for the recapture of the Illinois country and to attack St. Louis, New Orleans, and other Spanish posts on the Mississippi River. Spain, allied with France, had joined the war against Great Britain in 1779 and had rapidly gained control over British positions along the Mississippi in that year. 4 simultaneous movements were planned. Captain Henry Byrd. Henry Byrd is the main man here, right? With a force from Detroit was directed to amuse George Rogers Clark. George Rogers Clark, the genocidal maniac, the Kentucky frontiersman at the Falls of the Ohio, Louisville. That's where the Falls of the Ohio is. General John Campbell, 5th Duke of Argyll from Pensacola, after taking New Orleans, was to proceed up the Mississippi to Natchez, where he's to be joined by a 3rd force. Whatever, it's a huge fucking operation they're trying to do. So, from Fort Detroit, Captain Henry Byrd of the 8th Regiment of Foot led an American Indian Army of 1,000 men, accompanied by 150 white men, regulars of the 8th and 47th Regiments, Detroit Militia, and bombardiers of the Royal Regiment of Artillery, against the settlers of Kentucky in June 1780. So you got 1,000 Indians, 1,000 American Indian men, with 150 white people. This is Captain Henry Byrd's leading these people. When they reached the confluence of the Miami and Ohio rivers, his large Indian contingent concerned that Clark, a formidable presence in their view, was at the falls, insisted on attacking smaller forts and stations instead. While they might have successfully reached the falls while Clark was absent, he was coordinating defenses on the Mississippi with the Spanish. Byrd was unable to convince the Indians of his original plan. The Native Americans. The Native Americans versus the white Americans. Working its way without opposition along the Licking River, the vanguard of Byrd's force reached Ruddle Station. Ruddle Station, which is in Kentucky. It's right at the Licking River, base of the Licking River, north of Lexington. So they also this is Ruddle Station and Martin Station. So Ruddle Station was in northern Kentucky next to the Licking River, and you also have Martin Station. So Ruddle Station and Martin Station, both in northern Kentucky. So Byrd's invasion, he's got 1,000 Indians with 150 white people. They're all coming down to kill the Kentucky settlers, the white Americans. So General Henry Byrd, Simon Girty, Blue Jacket, Captain Alexander McKee were all part of this. Simon Girty and Blue Jacket. So it's a formidable vanguard. So Blue Jacket, Simon Girty was an interpreter. He He was an interpreter and he was a scout. So Simon Girty, Blue Jacket, and Captain Henry Byrd. Henry Byrd himself arrived the next day with the main body of his force, and cannon fire quickly breached the wooden walls of the station. Isaac Ruddle insisted on having the people under his protection treated as British captives under the protection of the small British contingent. The Indians ignored this and rushed into the fort to plunder and pillage. According to Byrd, they rushed in, tore the poor children from their mother's breast, killed and wounded many. After the Indians had divided the prisoners and loot to their satisfaction, they wanted to continue on to the next station. Captain Henry Byrd successfully got them to agree that prisoners taken in the future would be turned over to them at British discretion. Martin Station, not far from Ruddle Station, was similarly surprised and surrendered. The Indians honored the bargain with Byrd, and the prisoners were given over to the British soldiers. While the Indians next wanted to attack Lexington, the largest settlement in the area, Byrd ordered the expedition to end, citing depletion of provisions and reduced water flow on the Licking River for the transport of the field cannons. The expedition retraced its step, crossed back over the Ohio. Indians who lived in the area, Delaware, Shawnee, and Miami, began leaving the expeditions, taking their booty and prisoners with them. When Byrd reached Fort Detroit on August 4th, the force still had 300 prisoners taken from the two stations. The aftermath, the fear of Byrd's campaign instilled led many settlers to abandon their lands and flee back to the east. Captain Byrd's invasion of Kentucky in 1780, which is 4 years after 1776, after Chief Pluggy was killed in McClellan Station, and Washington's crossing the Delaware River at the same time. So 1776, this is 4 years ago, and the Cornwallis doesn't surrender Yorktown for another year. So this made all the people who was a lot of the Kentucky settlers went back east, since this wasn't their land to begin with. George Rogers Clark, who wanted instead to recruit settlers for campaigns against the Indian settlements north of the Ohio, were home to some of the expedition's participants, closed the only road out of Kentucky to the east in order to gain additional recruits and weapons. So George Rogers Clark is closing roads to get more people on his side. Casualties and losses: there's 20 people killed of the Kentucky settlers, and then 450 or 350 were captured. And only one British was killed and one Indian wounded. 2 cannons were left behind, and they're hidden. So no Indians died, 1 was wounded, 1 British man was killed, 20 Kentucky settlers was killed, and 400 of the Kentucky settlers was captured in 1780 in northern Kentucky by the Licking Rivers. Actually, like Kenton County, it looks like where the Battle of Blue Licks was, but it's Kenton County, let's see, Campbell County. It's right there in that area, right below Kenton and Campbell County. Next to Sanford Town, where the Germans actually, my Grips Over Germans originally pioneered. They were a settler, right, in 1869. So this is, 1869 is, 1780. That's about 90 years after all this bloodshed had happened. The Grips Over ancestors immigrated, so they became the new settlers. 90 years later, though. So that's Byrd's invasion of Kentucky. British outpost with 1,000 Indians and 150 white people. John Logan took part in several expeditions against the Shawnee, including some led by Daniel Boone, John Bowman, and George Rogers Clark. Daniel Boone is an Indian killer. He said he only, Clotter, in this book says he only killed 1. He says that Daniel Boone only admitted to killing 1. In Harrison Clotter's New History of Kentucky, published 1997. So John Logan was a dickhead too, along with Daniel Boone, John Bowman, and George Rogers Clark. The Battle of Blue Licks was fought on August 19th, 1782. 1782. This is 2 years later after Byrd's invasion. This is after Cornwallis had surrendered. So before, during the Revolutionary War, you had Byrd's invasion. They captured 400 Kentucky settlers. The Battle of Blue Licks was fought August 19, 1782. And it's considered one of the last battles of the American Revolutionary War, even though it happened after Cornwallis, 10 months after Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown. So on the hill next to Licking River, what is now Robertson County, Kentucky, but then Kentucky County, Virginia, forced about 50 American and Canadian loyalists, along with 300 American Indians. So about 350 people total, mostly American Indians, ambushed and routed 182 Kentucky militiamen. And it was the worst defeat for the Kentuckians during the Frontier War. 72 Kentucky settlers were killed, 7 Indians were killed, 11 captured of the Kentucky militiamen, the white Americans. So the white Americans, 72 was killed in the Battle of Blue Licks, August 19, 1782. So Battle of Blue Licks. The Battle of Blue Licks that was Simon Girty and Alexander McKee. So again, Simon Girty is back in Kentucky. Simon Girty and Alexander McKee was in Kentucky during Byrd's invasion. So you had Captain Henry Byrd's invasion of Kentucky in 1780. 2 years later, Simon Girty, Alexander McKee is back in town, and now they're killing Daniel Boone's people. Israel Boone was killed in this war. Daniel Boone falsely was led into a charge. The fucking psycho, Hugh McGarry. Hugh McGarry is a fucking psycho fucking low-life piece of shit. Hugh McGarry, he was a huge racist, but he was the reason why the Battle of Blue Licks was lost. They were following the Indians, but they didn't think that the Indians were actually that smart, and they led them into an ambush. Since the white Americans were following the Indians, that led Hugh McGarry and Daniel Boone were following the Indians because they said, oh, they attacked us and then they ran, so you know they're on the run, let's go chase them. And when they were going to chase them, they're about to cross the river, and when they're about to cross the river, Hugh McGarry says, you know, I'm not a coward. Hugh McGarry was like, them that ain't cowards, follow me. So if you ain't cowards, follow me. And then Hugh McGarry charges over the water. And the men started to follow McGarry, and so did the officers who hoped to restore order. And then Daniel Boone said, we're all slaughtered men now, and he crossed the river. Most of the men dismounted. They formed a line of battle several roads deep. They advanced up the hill. Todd McGarry in the center, Trigg on the right, Boone on the left. As Boone had suspected, Caldwell's force was waiting on the other side, concealed in the ravines. When the Kentuckians reached the summit, the Indians opened fire at close range with devastating accuracy. Within 5 minutes, the center and the right of the Kentucky line fell back. Only Boone's men on the left managed to push forward. Trigg and Todd, easy targets on horseback, were shot dead. Kentuckians began to flee down the hill, fighting hand-to-hand with other Indians who had flanked them. McGarry rode up to Boone's company and told him everyone was retreating and that Boone was now surrounded. Boone ordered his men to retreat. He grabbed a riderless horse and he ordered his 23-year-old son Israel to mount it. He turned to look for a horse for himself. Israel suddenly fell to the ground, shot through the neck. When Boone realized his son was dead, mounted the horse and joined in the retreat. So that's convenient for Daniel Boone. His fucking son dies. Israel's killed. Fucking Simon Girty kills Israel, right? Because it's all Simon Girty. Oh, there was a white guy fighting with the Indians. Alexander McKee was there too. But Israel dies, and that gives Daniel Boone a horse to ride off on. So good for Daniel Boone. But that's twice. 2 sons of Daniel Boone have been killed by Indians so far. You would think Daniel Boone would get the picture.